I never thought borrowing notes could feel like stepping into a storm. But that's exactly how it hit me the moment I pressed the buzzer at her building, my backpack awkwardly slung over one shoulder, fingers tapping the strap like I could drum my courage into existence. The door clicked, I stepped in, and, well, it wasn't her who greeted me. Her sister opened the door instead. She was leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed, hair falling just past her shoulders in a lazy curve. "I've been waiting for you," she said. No smile. Not exactly. More like a statement hanging in the air, heavy, deliberate. My stomach nodded. Sorry, I didn't mean to." My words stumbled before they even left my mouth. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing with something I couldn't place. Amusement, maybe, or curiosity. She let the silence stretch. I felt the weight of her gaze, and then the scent hit me. Something warm, faintly floral but not overpowering, and for a second my thoughts scattered. "She's in the apartment," the sister finally said, stepping aside. "Go on in." I stepped past her, and there she was. Mid-40s, confidently perched on a worn-out armchair, one leg curled beneath her, laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up from her screen like she'd been expecting me, but her smile was small, controlled, like a secret she wasn't quite ready to tell. Her hair had those soft silver streaks that caught the light in a way that made me want to reach out and tuck it behind her ear, though I'd never, ever do that. "Hey," I said, voice too loud for the quiet apartment. My throat went dry instantly. She looked up again, just a flicker of an eyebrow raising, and something in that glance made my chest tighten. It wasn't exactly welcome, it was noticing me. Fully, deliberately, without pretense. She gestured toward a pile of notebooks on the coffee table. "Notes? You really do pick the busiest week, huh?" Her voice was warm, easy, but threaded with that subtle edge of authority. Like she knew something I didn't. I nodded, moving to grab them, my hands brushing against hers for the briefest second. It was electric, though I tried not to let it register. My fingers tingled. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and outside the window, a drizzle tapped against the glass. We both paused, listening to it for a beat. She tilted her head, lips quirking as if she wanted to say something but decided against it. I caught myself staring, probably too long, until a cough escaped me. "You're staring," she said softly, more like a note of observation than a reprimand. I felt my ears flush. Sorry. It's just, well, you look." My words died somewhere between my brain and my mouth. She laughed lightly, the kind of sound that felt like it wrapped around you without trying. She leaned back in her chair, eyes meeting mine, steady and calm, and the space between us seemed to pulse. There was no rush, no overt spark, just this tiny, undeniable charge that made me hyper-aware of every breath, every movement. I wanted to say something, anything, to break it, but the words wouldn't come. When I finally turned back to the notebooks, my fingers trembled slightly, and I caught myself thinking, absurdly, that even this mundane exchange, felt like something I'd replay in my head 1,000 times. And then, as I stood to leave, she gave me a look. Just a look. Nothing more. But it lingered. Too long. Enough to make me step out into the drizzle, backpack heavier than it should have been, and feel that small, persistent ache of wanting to see her again. I couldn't stop thinking about that look. I didn't mean to show up again so soon, but her message had been vague. "Can you help me sort through these?" And I couldn't resist. The rain had stopped, leaving the street glistening, reflections of neon signs puddled in the asphalt. By the time I reached her apartment, the evening light had softened, and the city felt quieter somehow. She was already there, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a thin scarf hanging loose around her neck. Her laptop was open, documents scattered across the table. She didn't look up at first, just moved with a kind of quiet determination that made me pause. I wanted to speak, but all I could do was lean against the doorframe, waiting for her to notice. "Hey," I said finally, softer this time. She glanced up, her eyes calculating, calm, but there was a flicker, something almost like relief, before it vanished behind that wall she carried so well. "Thanks for coming," she said, voice even, polite. Not warm, not cold, just measured. I nodded, trying not to stare, but it was impossible. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the slight furrow in her brow as she read a document. I caught myself wanting to memorize every detail. We worked in silence for a while. My hands shifted papers, moved files from one pile to another, while she typed notes, occasionally humming something low and uncertain. She let out a tiny sigh, and I noticed it, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly, like she carried the weight of far too many things at once. "You look tired," I said, almost without thinking. Her hands froze over the keyboard. She glanced up at me, startled, and then shook her head, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly, and returned to typing. But her fingers trembled slightly, and I caught the faint curve of worry lines at the corners of her eyes. She tried to mask it, but small things always slip through. I wanted to ask more, to offer something she didn't have to ask for, but I stayed quiet. There was a rhythm to the room. The scratch of pen on paper, the quiet tap of keys, my occasional shuffle of folders. And somewhere in that rhythm, I noticed her laugh, a soft, almost hesitant thing that came out when she misread a file or muttered to herself. It was brief, almost fragile, but it lingered in my chest longer than it should have. At one point, I handed her a folder, and our fingers brushed. She looked at me, eyes wide for the briefest second, and then diverted her gaze. But the electricity of that touch didn't fade. It hovered between us, subtle but persistent, like a current we both felt but neither wanted to name. The work slowed. Papers stacked, screens dimmed, and the evening light deepened into gold and shadow. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closing for a heartbeat, hands clasped loosely in her lap. I watched, unsure whether to speak, to move, to just disappear and give her the space she clearly needed. Instead, I stayed, close enough to see the small exhale that escaped her lips, to notice how her fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the table edge, but not so close that she would feel trapped. There was a hesitation there, a fragile pause in her usual composure, that made my chest tighten without permission. When she finally opened her eyes, they found mine almost instinctively. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just that quiet charge in the air, something unclaimed, dangerous in its restraint. I could feel it too, the pull, gentle but undeniable. And I realized, with a mix of dread and longing, that I didn't want to let go. The rain had started again, heavier this time, drumming against the apartment windows in a steady, insistent rhythm. I was perched on the edge of her sofa, half reading a text she'd asked me to check, half watching her as she moved around the kitchen, pouring coffee with that precise, deliberate grace that made every small gesture seem weighty. "Do you take sugar?" she asked, her voice low, almost conversational, but there was a pause, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear my answer. I nodded, and she poured it without looking at me, just the tiniest tremor in her hand betraying her composure. We sat in the living room afterward, the coffee between us warm but forgotten. The storm outside made the apartment feel cocooned, isolated from the world, and for a moment I thought about reaching across, letting my hand brush hers. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way she held herself, a wall of calm confidence, a faint hesitancy, kept me from moving, even though every nerve in my body screamed to. "I used to come here a lot," she said suddenly, almost a whisper. "Not for the coffee exactly, just to think." Her eyes were fixed on the window, on the way raindrops raced each other down the glass. There was a shadow there, something unspoken, and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to ask what she meant, to bridge the silence, but I stayed quiet. I knew she'd share only what she wanted. So I listened, absorbing the rhythm of her voice, the tilt of her head, the way she wrapped her hands around her mug like it could hold her whole. Then her phone buzzed on the table. I noticed the name before she did, and my heart twisted. Someone from her past, someone whose presence should have stayed elsewhere. She glanced down, a flicker of annoyance, but quickly masked it. I offered a small, neutral smile, a silent shield of support, and she gave a nearly imperceptible nod. We returned to the sofa, and for a while, we didn't speak. I caught myself leaning slightly closer, the space between us shrinking with every passing second, the air thick with the almost things we weren't saying. I could feel her warmth, the faint scent of whatever she'd been wearing today, the softness of her hair when she absent-mindedly brushed it from her face. For a moment, I thought she might lean into me, lean enough to close that tiny gap. My fingers twitched, poised to reach out, but restraint held me frozen. I didn't want to push. I didn't want to ruin what we had, whatever fragile, electric balance that was. She laughed quietly at something she muttered under her breath, a low, vulnerable sound that made me want to speak, to admit the swirl of feelings I'd been stuffing down. But the moment evaporated. A car horn outside, a distant shout, and suddenly the spell was broken. She straightened, smoothing her blouse, and looked at me with a polite, measured smile. I stayed where I was, heart hammering, conscious of the distance we'd restored between us. And yet, that tiny pulse, that almost touch, lingered. The air seemed to hum, as though the storm itself had left its charge behind, waiting for us both to act, or to fail. I left that night with a tight knot in my chest, and for hours afterward, I could still feel the heat of proximity, the unspoken question hanging between us. What if we had moved, just once, across that invisible line? I found her on the balcony that evening, leaning against the railing, city lights flickering in the distance like fragments of a world I couldn't touch. I didn't knock or announce myself. Somehow, I knew she wouldn't have wanted that. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete and her perfume, a quiet combination that made my chest tighten. "Hey," I said softly, stepping closer. She didn't turn immediately. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. There was something unspoken in the way she held herself, tense, yet fragile. "Hey," she replied at last, voice barely above the hum of distant traffic. She finally looked at me, and I could see it. The exhaustion, the doubt, the tiny cracks in the confidence she always wore like armor. I stayed silent, not knowing what to say, feeling the pull of every unsaid word. "Do you ever wonder why we do this?" she asked, her gaze dropping to the wet railing beneath her hands. "Why we keep doing the same things over and over, pretending it's normal?" I swallowed, unsure how to answer. My throat was tight, heart hammering in a way that made me feel guilty for noticing. I don't know," I admitted, quieter than I expected. "I guess I just follow along." My words sounded weak, inadequate. She tilted her head, letting the silence grow. I watched her fingers trace the edge of the railing, slow, deliberate, like she was counting every heartbeat. I noticed the faint line of tension along her jaw, the way her shoulders slumped just a fraction. Every small movement told me more than words ever could. "I can't," she began, then stopped, lips parting and closing without a sound. Her eyes met mine again, searching, almost pleading. "I can't pretend anymore that this, whatever this is, isn't complicated. And I don't even know if I want it to be normal, or if I can handle it." I nodded, though I didn't speak. My hands itched to reach out, to offer some grounding presence, but I stayed still. There was a fragile honesty in that moment that didn't need physical comfort. It needed recognition. Her gaze dropped again, and I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands. It was rare, almost never seen, but there it was, raw and human, and it made my chest ache. I wanted to say something, anything to make it better, but the truth was I had no words. Not for her. Not for the storm we'd created between us, quiet and relentless. For a while, we just stood there, breathing, the city humming below us, sharing the weight of a silence that spoke louder than any touch could. Every unspoken thought hovered, fragile and potent, as if saying it aloud might shatter the delicate thread holding us together. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," she whispered finally, voice breaking, almost lost in the wind. "I don't know if I'm even doing it for me anymore." I wanted to move, to tell her it was okay, that whatever this was, we'd figure it out. But I stayed frozen, because the truth was, I didn't know either. And in that vulnerability, in that quiet unraveling of her carefully constructed composure, I felt more exposed than I ever had before. She didn't look at me again, and I didn't force her. The weight of her words lingered, settling over us both. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that nothing would ever feel normal again. I don't even know who I am when you're around, she whispered, so soft I almost didn't hear it. And for a moment, I could only breathe, caught in the gravity of her vulnerability. I hadn't expected her to invite me in that evening. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and rain, the city outside humming low and distant. She motioned toward the living room, where a single lamp cast golden circles on the floor. Papers were stacked neatly on the table, but one envelope lay slightly apart, edges worn, as if it had been handled too many times. "I found this," she said, voice careful, almost fragile. She held it like it weighed more than its size, like it contained something too sharp to touch directly. My heart skipped a beat, though I couldn't explain why. "It's from him," she continued, and for the first time, I noticed her hands trembling. Not violently, just the faintest quiver, the kind that makes your chest clench when you see it. "I've read it 100 times and I never sent a reply. I don't know why." She folded her fingers over the envelope, gazed distant. I wanted to ask who he was, but I didn't. I could tell, without asking, that it mattered, that it had shaped her in ways she wouldn't say aloud. "I loved him," she said finally, almost to herself. Her voice cracked in the most human, unbearable way. I thought we could fix it. But sometimes sometimes it's not enough." I felt a strange stillness settle in me. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but I stayed quiet, letting her words hang between us. I noticed the subtle lines on her face, the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as if carrying decades of choices, regrets, and quiet heartbreak. I didn't tell anyone this," she whispered, eyes finally meeting mine. There was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen before, a pause in her usual armor. "Not even my sister. I couldn't. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that she could carry it with me if she wanted, but I didn't know how to phrase it without sounding like I was stepping over some invisible line. Instead, I just nodded, and my fingers brushed against the envelope when I leaned slightly closer. That small touch, a careless, almost accidental movement, made both of us catch our breath. Then she reached for a small photo tucked inside the envelope, holding it up to the lamp's light. It was old, faded, a memory she hadn't shared with anyone. She looked at it for a long moment, then back at me. There was no dramatics, no shouting, just a quiet tremor in her eyes that made my chest ache. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said, voice barely audible. "Maybe because it feels like you understand, even if you don't." I wanted to tell her I did understand, that I could see the weight she'd carried, that I could feel the spaces she'd left empty for herself. But the words lodged somewhere in my throat, heavy with unspoken meaning. We sat there, side by side but not touching, the envelope and photo between us, the city outside our bubble of quiet. And yet, something had shifted. I didn't know if it was fear, desire, or empathy, but the world I'd thought I knew had tilted, just slightly, and I could feel the pull of something I hadn't dared to name. When she finally set the photo down, her hand lingered on it for a heartbeat too long, and I realized, with a slow, sinking certainty, that neither of us would leave this room unchanged. I showed up without a plan, without a reason beyond the impulse I couldn't explain. She opened the door, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no pretense. The city outside was muted by the evening drizzle, the streetlights reflecting in puddles like tiny, trembling lanterns. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. Her voice had that quiet strength I'd come to notice, the kind that makes you listen without having to say anything. I nodded, stepping past her, and we settled in the living room, the apartment dim but warm. We didn't speak immediately. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, thick with all the unsaid moments we'd accumulated. She poured tea, the steam curling lazily upward, and I watched her hands. The small movements, the way her fingers flexed around the cup, the slight tremor when she shifted her weight, it all felt intimate without being invasive. I'm tired," she said finally, voice low, honest. "Not tired from work, not just physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from carrying too much alone. I nodded, understanding without question. I moved closer, careful, respecting the space she'd carved out, and she didn't pull away. For the first time, there was no pretense between us. No questions, no deflections, no guarded walls. Just presence. Just acknowledgement. She leaned back in her chair, and I lowered myself to the floor beside her, knees bent, hands resting loosely on mine. It was absurdly simple, and yet the gravity of it made my chest ache. There was no declaration, no grand gesture, just the quiet recognition that we had found a fragile, earned closeness. I noticed her breath even out, the faint exhale that wasn't just relief but acceptance. Her shoulder brushed against mine, almost imperceptibly, and I felt the smallest spark, the kind that doesn't need words to exist. My hand itched to reach for hers, and when I did, our fingers met with a natural, unforced ease. Neither of us flinched. Neither of us let go. We didn't talk about what had been or what might come. We didn't label it. We simply existed in that shared space, two imperfect people who had found a way to meet without pretending, without rushing, without expectation. The storm outside slowed to a drizzle. The city's hum softened, and inside that room, nothing else mattered. I noticed the way her gaze softened when she caught me looking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without knowing it. She smiled, almost imperceptibly, and it felt like a promise, a quiet one, to herself as much as to me, that we could be here without breaking. The tea had cooled. The lamp's light flickered, and still, we stayed there, fingers intertwined, the silence no longer heavy but full of understanding, shared decision, and unspoken trust. At some point, her head tilted, brushing my shoulder lightly. Not a lean, not a rest, just a small, human acknowledgement of closeness. And I realized, in that gentle, fleeting touch, that this, the calm, the presence, the simplicity, was enough. I didn't want more. I didn't want less. We sat like that, the world outside forgotten, the storm gone, and I knew, finally, that nothing needed to be said. The quiet finality of our connection was enough. Looking back now, months later, it's strange how ordinary everything seemed, and yet how profoundly nothing was ever the same. I still remember the way she moved through her apartment that first night I stayed past sunset, the quiet strength that had always drawn me in. But what I didn't notice then, what I only understand now, was how much she let me in without a word, without forcing me to claim anything I wasn't ready to. I've changed. I notice more, the small pauses in conversation, the way someone holds a cup, the almost imperceptible tremor in a smile when they're thinking about something painful. I've learned that love isn't always loud or sweeping. Sometimes it's sitting in a dimly lit living room, fingers brushing just enough to know that you belong there. She's changed too. She's softer in some ways, not less strong, but less armored. She laughs more freely, though it still carries that trace of caution that I've grown to treasure. And there's a quiet confidence in the way she trusts me to see her, not just the surface, but the edges she's always kept hidden. We learned, in our own careful, tentative way, that connection isn't about fireworks or declarations. It's in the accumulation of small gestures, the shared silences, the almost touch, the understanding that doesn't need words. It's in recognizing when someone needs space and being present when they don't. It's in the pull that brings you closer without ever forcing it. Sometimes I catch myself replaying moments, her fingers brushing the edge of the photo she had kept for years, the quiet exhale on the balcony, the subtle electricity of a hand lightly resting on mine. Each memory is like a pulse, a reminder that what we have isn't perfect, but it's ours, earned, real, and rare. I've learned that love isn't about the absence of fear. It's about staying despite it, about letting someone in, even when it's messy, even when it's complicated. It's about understanding that vulnerability doesn't weaken you. It makes you human, makes you capable of feeling deeply without apology. And sometimes, when the city hums outside and the evening light filters in, I still feel that quiet charge between us. Not urgent, not desperate, just steady, gentle, undeniable. That's how I know we've survived the moments we didn't understand, the pauses that felt unbearable, the stormy nights that seemed endless. And I know we'll keep surviving, together, in our own quiet way. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?